Washington, D.C., April 12, 1945. A warm spring afternoon. Cherry blossoms were still hanging onto the trees around the tidal basin, and the city felt strangely calm for a nation still at war on two fronts. Inside the U.S. Capitol, Vice President Harry S. Truman was finishing a routine meeting with House leaders about post-war industrial reconversion, a fairly ordinary subject for an afternoon that was about to become anything but ordinary. At 5:25 p.m., Truman received a message asking him to come to the White House immediately. No explanation. Just urgency. He assumed President Roosevelt needed him to review a bill or discuss a diplomatic note from Moscow. Truman walked across Pennsylvania Avenue without any sense that the world he knew was minutes away from collapsing. When he stepped into the White House, he was met not by a secretary, not by a staffer, but by Eleanor Roosevelt herself. She placed a hand on his shoulder, looked him directly in the eyes, and said the words that almost knocked the breath out of him. "Harry, the president is dead." Truman later said he felt as if the entire universe had fallen on him. Roosevelt had been president for more than 12 years. He was the architect of the New Deal, the commander-in-chief through the darkest years of World War II, the man whose presence alone seemed to steady the nation. Now he was gone, and the presidency belonged to a man who had met with him only a few times since being sworn in as vice president. Within hours, Truman took the oath of office. Reporters squeezed into the Oval Office, flashes popped, and everyone stared at a man who had not even been told about half the programs he now commanded. As soon as the photographers left, cabinet members lined up to pledge loyalty and brief him on crises Roosevelt had kept closely held. One of the last men to speak with him that night was Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He was 80 years old, stiff, gray, and carrying a leather folder Truman had never seen before. When the door closed behind them, Stimson lowered his voice. "Mr. President, there is something you must know." He did not hand Truman the folder. Not yet. Instead, he spoke slowly, as if choosing every word like it was a grenade with the pin halfway pulled. "The United States has underway an undertaking of great significance, a weapon of unusually destructive force." That was all he said. No specifics, no diagrams, no budget numbers. Nothing about Los Alamos, or the laboratories scattered across the country, or the factories secretly burning through more electricity than entire American cities. And certainly nothing about the theoretical possibility of destroying an entire city in a single moment. Truman nodded, trying not to show the shock rising in his chest. Stimson didn't linger. He closed the folder without ever opening it in front of the new president. Then he left the Oval Office as quietly as he had entered. That night, Truman went home to Blair House and wrote in his diary. The words were simple and chilling. "We are perfecting an explosive great enough to destroy the whole world." He had been president for less than 6 hours, and already he was carrying a secret bigger than anything he had imagined, but he still did not know the full truth. He had only been given a warning, a glimpse of something vast, hidden, and terrifying. The reality was even stranger. Harry Truman, the new commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in history, did not yet know the name of the project he supposedly controlled. For the moment, he was a president who could launch armies across continents but did not know that his country was building the most destructive weapon ever conceived. But the secrecy wasn't personal. It wasn't political. It was systemic. Roosevelt had deliberately kept the Manhattan Project locked within a small circle of advisors, scientists, and military officers. Even the vice president had no authorization. The truth, the real truth, would not reach Truman until 13 days later. For now, he only had a sentence in his diary and a war still raging across the Pacific. As the night of April 12th faded into the early hours of April 13th, Truman faced a world he had inherited but did not yet understand. And somewhere in the New Mexico desert, inside a dusty laboratory hidden behind fences and code names, scientists were racing to finish a weapon that could end the war or change humanity forever. 13 days remained before Harry Truman would finally learn the full details of the Manhattan Project. And when he did, he would have to make a decision no American president before or since has ever had to make. In the days after Roosevelt's death, Washington closed in around Harry Truman like a machine trying to restart itself. Briefings poured in, generals demanded direction, and diplomats asked for decisions he was never prepared for. Yet even as he stepped into the center of American power, Truman remained unaware of the country's most important military secret. Roosevelt had kept the Manhattan Project locked behind layers of classification, Not even his vice president was told. The separation wasn't personal, it was deliberate. Roosevelt believed the atomic program was too sensitive, too dangerous, and too uncertain to reveal beyond a handful of trusted advisors. Truman had brushed against the truth once, without knowing it. In 1943, as a senator leading investigations into war spending, he found a mysterious plant in Minneapolis receiving huge funding with almost no explanation. When he tried to inquire, Secretary of War Henry Stimson called him directly. His message was short. "Senator, you must not pursue this." Truman had backed off, assuming it was routine wartime secrecy. Now, as president, he understood that call had been a warning to stay away from the Manhattan Project's perimeter. By April 1945, the Pacific War was escalating. In Okinawa, American forces faced brutal resistance. Casualty lists grew longer every day. Military planners warned that a full invasion of Japan could cost up to 1 million American lives. The situation was nearing a breaking point. And through all of it, Truman still didn't know the details of the weapon Roosevelt had hinted at on his first night in office. April 25, 1945, 13 days after Truman became president, Henry Stimson and General Leslie Groves walked into the Oval Office carrying a thick leather folder, the file Roosevelt never gave him. Stimson spoke first. "Mr. President, this is the most secret program of the war. It is called the Manhattan Engineer District." It was the first time Truman ever heard the name. Groves opened the folder and explained the project plainly. America was trying to release the energy of the atom to create a weapon capable of destroying an entire city. Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford were producing materials on a scale Truman had never imagined. More than $2 billion had already been spent. Germany had failed to build a bomb, but the Soviet Union might succeed within 4 years. The implications were immediate. This wasn't only a weapon to end the war with Japan, it was something that would shape global power for decades. Stimson then raised the question Roosevelt had never settled. Which allies, if any, should be told? Should Stalin know? Should the bomb be revealed publicly? Each answer risked changing the post-war world. Truman absorbed everything. He didn't say much, but he understood what had been placed in his hands. The responsibility Roosevelt carried alone had now passed to him. When the meeting ended, Truman stayed seated for a long time. He had been president less than 2 weeks, and now he commanded a weapon unlike anything in history, a weapon that could end World War II or redefine what war meant. Late April 1945. As Truman tried to absorb the truth about the Manhattan Project, the world around him was shifting at breathtaking speed. Nazi Germany was collapsing, Berlin was burning, and Europe's war was almost over. But the end of fighting in Europe only pushed Truman toward a far more difficult problem: Japan. On Okinawa, American forces were locked in one of the deadliest battles of the entire war. Kamikaze attacks hit U.S. ships daily. Marines fought through caves, tunnels, and cliffs that swallowed men whole. Every morning, Truman received casualty lists that seemed endless. The Joint Chiefs estimated that invading Japan's home islands could cost up to 1 million American lives, and that number didn't include the Japanese civilians preparing to fight with everything from rifles to bamboo spears. Truman met privately with his top military advisors. They told him Japan showed no real sign of surrender. The Japanese leadership was split between moderates searching for a way out and hardliners vowing to resist even if the nation burned. American intelligence reported that the same desperation seen on Okinawa would likely be repeated, on a far larger scale, on the Japanese mainland. Truman listened without emotion, then asked the question that mattered most. Is there any way to end the war faster? Henry Stimson paused before answering. There may be, Mr. President, but we must consider it carefully. The atomic bomb was no longer theoretical, it was weeks from reality. Truman reviewed every possible alternative: diplomatic overtures, conditional surrender, warnings, demonstrations of force, but each intelligence report came back the same. Japan would not surrender unconditionally, and a full-scale invasion would be catastrophic. At the same time, Truman could not ignore what was happening beyond Japan. With Germany collapsing, tensions with the Soviet Union were growing. Churchill warned him that Stalin intended to dominate Eastern Europe. American intelligence suggested Moscow's ambitions were expanding, and that Soviet involvement in Asia was inevitable. Stimson soon delivered a private message Truman never forgot. Mr. President, this weapon may affect not only Japan, but the behavior of the Russians in the post-war world. Truman didn't comment, but he understood immediately. The bomb was both a military weapon and a diplomatic one. Ending the war and shaping the world order were becoming the same problem. As casualty figures rose and global politics shifted, Truman realized he needed structured guidance, not just from generals, but from scientists, civilians, and senior policymakers who understood the consequences of this new weapon. And so, in early June 1945, he created a secret advisory body with a single purpose: to determine how the atomic bomb should be used, if it should be used at all. It would be called the Interim Committee, and its recommendations would define everything that followed. Early June 1945. 7 weeks after learning the truth about the Manhattan Project, Truman authorized a secret advisory body to help him confront the most consequential question of the war. It was called the Interim Committee, a small, highly classified group with a single purpose: advise the president on whether the atomic bomb should be used, and how. The members represented the most powerful civilian, scientific, and military voices in the country. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Presidential Advisor James Burns, Vannevar Bush, Head of Wartime Scientific Research, MIT President Carl Compton, General Leslie Groves, and senior scientists connected to Los Alamos. From the first meeting, the tone was blunt. Scientists described the bomb's potential blast radius, thermal heat, firestorms, and the possibility of instant mass casualties. Military leaders outlined the cost of continuing the war without it. Japan showed no intention of surrendering. Okinawa proved they would fight to the last, and an invasion of the home islands could result in up to 1 million American casualties. The committee debated every option, warning Japan, demonstrating the bomb on an empty island, using it only on military targets, or preserving the emperor as a condition for surrender. Each idea carried enormous risk. A failed demonstration could strengthen Japan's resolve. A warning might allow Japan to move prisoners or prepare defenses. And a limited strike might not generate the psychological shock needed to force surrender. After days of analysis, the committee reached a clear recommendation: use the bomb against a military-industrial target. Use it without prior warning. Use it as soon as it is ready. Truman read their conclusions carefully. He didn't speak much, but he understood the logic and the stakes. Still, he wasn't finished searching for alternatives. He ordered diplomats and intelligence officers to monitor every signal from Tokyo, hoping for a sign that Japan might consider surrender before the bomb was completed. None came. Reports continued to show a government dominated by hardliners refusing unconditional surrender, regardless of civilian suffering. Meanwhile, tensions with the Soviet Union were rising. Churchill warned Truman that Stalin planned to dominate Eastern Europe. American intelligence confirmed Soviet pressure across the region. Stimson privately noted that the bomb could influence Soviet behavior in the post-war world, a point Truman absorbed, even if he didn't respond aloud. By mid-June, one truth was unavoidable. The bomb was nearly finished, and Truman would soon face a decision no president in history had confronted. But before that moment arrived, he needed proof that the weapon worked. That proof would come in the New Mexico desert, at a place called Trinity. Mid-July 1945. As Truman traveled to Potsdam for his first major summit with the Allies, the scientists of the Manhattan Project prepared for the moment that would define the fate of the war, the first full test of an atomic bomb. The test site was a remote desert stretch in New Mexico called Trinity. For months, scientists at Los Alamos had pushed physics to its limits, unsure whether the bomb would detonate as expected, misfire, or release energy beyond their calculations. Even General Leslie Groves admitted that success wasn't guaranteed. On July 16, 1945, just before dawn, a small group of observers gathered in bunkers several miles from the test tower. The device, a spherical, experimental weapon, sat atop a steel structure, wired and ready. Storms had threatened to delay the test, but the clouds cleared just enough to proceed. At 5:29 a.m., the countdown began. A flash brighter than the sun erupted across the desert. The fireball expanded instantly, vaporizing the tower and turning desert sand into green glass. Moments later, a tremendous shockwave struck the bunkers, shaking the ground and rattling equipment. Above it all rose the first mushroom cloud in human history, boiling upward, violent and mesmerizing. Robert Oppenheimer later recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita: "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. General Groves had a simpler reaction. It worked. Within hours, a coded message left the test site. Security was tight, so the report Truman received in Potsdam was deliberately vague. The experiment has been completed. Results appear satisfactory. Truman now had the confirmation he'd been waiting for. The atomic bomb was no longer an idea. It was operational, proven, and ready for use. He slipped the message into his pocket and walked into the opening session of the Potsdam Conference, where Stalin sat across from him. Only Truman knew that the United States now possessed a weapon capable of ending the war in a single stroke. But before deciding to use it, Truman needed to confront a final question. Would Japan be warned? The answer took the form of a document drafted in Germany, the Potsdam Declaration. Late July 1945. With the Trinity test confirmed a success, Truman now carried a weapon that could end the war, but he refused to use it without offering Japan one final chance to surrender. That chance came in the form of a document drafted in a Berlin suburb, at a conference table surrounded by maps, military reports, and the uneasy partnership of three Allied leaders, Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek. It would be known as the Potsdam Declaration. Truman's advisors debated every word. The tone had to be firm but not vindictive, final, but still offering a path out of destruction. Above all, it needed to make the stakes unmistakably clear. The declaration demanded Japan's unconditional surrender, listing the terms the Allies would impose once the war ended. It guaranteed that Japan would not be enslaved or annihilated, but insisted its military leadership, the architects of aggression, be removed. It also promised democratic reforms and economic rebuilding once peace was restored. But one sentence stood above all the others. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. The wording was intentional. The bomb itself was never mentioned, but the message was unmistakable. Continue fighting, and Japan would face consequences beyond anything it had endured so far. The declaration was broadcast by radio across the Pacific. American planes dropped thousands of leaflets carrying the message over Japanese cities. Newspapers around the world printed the terms in bold headlines. Truman made sure there was no ambiguity, no secret conditions, no hidden traps. Japan had a clear choice. Inside Japan's war cabinet, the response was chaos. Moderates believed the nation had reached the breaking point and should negotiate. Hardliners insisted surrender was unthinkable even if the country burned. Their internal struggle paralyzed decision-making. Then came the phrase that sealed their fate. Japan's Prime Minister, Kantaro Suzuki, told reporters the government would treat the Potsdam Declaration with mokusatsu. To Western ears, the translation was simple. We ignore it. We treat it with silent contempt. Truman saw the broadcasts. The Allied leaders saw them. Japan had effectively rejected the final warning. Truman didn't react publicly. He didn't call for celebration or outrage. He simply returned to the reality he had been trying to avoid. If Japan refused to surrender, the war could only end in two ways: a catastrophic invasion, or the use of the new weapon now waiting in New Mexico. And with every passing day, American soldiers continued dying across the Pacific. The Japanese government's decision left Truman with no remaining diplomatic tools. There were no secret negotiations, no last-minute concessions, no sign the military junta in Tokyo was willing to accept unconditional surrender. Truman reviewed intelligence reports again, searching for any hint Japan might reconsider. None appeared. Every intercepted message showed the same determination: fight on, no matter the cost. The Potsdam Declaration had been the final chance to prevent what was coming. Japan had chosen not to take it. A new deadline was now approaching, not diplomatic, but operational. The bomb was ready. What remained was Truman's final authorization. By the end of July 1945, the situation around Truman had tightened into a single unavoidable line. Japan had rejected the Potsdam Declaration. American casualties were still climbing in the Pacific, and the atomic bomb was now fully operational. All that remained was for the President of the United States to decide whether it would be used. On July 31st, inside a secure villa outside Berlin, Harry Truman sat at a small wooden desk with a single sheet of paper in front of him. It was a directive drafted by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, short, precise, and carrying the weight of millions of lives. The document laid out one clear instruction: authorized the use of the atomic bomb against Japan once weather and military conditions permitted, any time after August 2nd. It did not list specific cities. It did not describe the weapon. It did not debate morality or alternatives. It simply gave permission. Truman read the document carefully. He understood the consequences better than anyone. He had reviewed casualty estimates for an invasion. He had seen the intercepted Japanese messages confirming their refusal to surrender. He had watched the war grind toward a final, bloody climax. And he had offered Japan one last chance to stop it, a chance they chose not to take. It didn't make the decision easy. It made it unavoidable. Truman picked up a pen, the same model he used to sign dozens of wartime directives, and wrote, "Release when ready, but not sooner than August 2nd. No flourish, no speech, just a signature." The moment his pen left the paper, the decision was made. The order would be transmitted through secure channels to General Thomas Handy at the Pentagon, then routed to General Carl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces. Everything that followed, every crew assignment, every flight plan, every bomb assembly, now ran on a clock that Truman had just started. He didn't announce the decision to the public. He didn't even announce it to most of his cabinet. But the people who needed to know understood immediately. The internal cables sent from Potsdam back to Washington carried the quiet seriousness of final instructions. The Manhattan Project's military units began preparing the weapon codenamed Little Boy for transport to the Pacific. Its plutonium cousin, Fat Man, wasn't far behind. Meanwhile, Truman continued attending sessions at the Potsdam Conference. He met with Stalin, met with Churchill, discussed borders, reparations, and post-war reconstruction. But underneath all the discussions, Truman carried a secret no other leader at the table understood. He had already signed the order that could end the war in days. During a brief break, Winston Churchill privately asked Truman whether the new weapon was ready. Truman answered only with a slight nod, just enough to confirm what Churchill suspected. The United States now held a weapon that would change the world. Back in Washington, Stimson gathered his staff and reviewed the target list: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, Nagasaki. Each selection had been chosen based on military value, industrial capacity, and the ability to demonstrate the bomb's full destructive effect. There was no turning back. By the evening of July 31st, Truman returned to his quarters in Potsdam. He went through the day's notes, reviewed diplomatic cables, and prepared for the next round of negotiations. He carried out his duties as if nothing monumental had occurred, because the weight of the decision didn't need a dramatic moment. It needed clarity, and he had already reached it. In the early hours of August 6th, a specially modified B-29 bomber named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island in the Pacific. Its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, had been hand-selected for discipline, steadiness, and an unusual ability to operate under pressure. None of the airmen were told the full destructive potential of what they were carrying, only that the mission could end the war. In its bomb bay rested Little Boy, a uranium-based atomic bomb assembled under extreme secrecy. It had never been used in combat before. The mission orders were simple: fly to Hiroshima, release the weapon, return home. As the plane approached the target, the crew saw a city waking up for another morning: trams running, workers biking to factories, smoke rising from chimneys. Hiroshima was chosen not for revenge, but because it was a major military-industrial center, home to army headquarters, war industries, and supply lines critical to Japan's defense. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. Little Boy fell for 44 seconds. Then a blinding flash erupted over the city. A fireball hotter than the surface of the sun expanded instantly, flattening everything within a mile. Buildings, bridges, and entire neighborhoods disintegrated. Thousands of people died before they could even register the light. A shockwave roared outward, shattering windows miles away and tossing streetcars like toys. Fires ignited across the city. Clouds boiled into the sky, forming the first wartime mushroom cloud. The Enola Gay banked hard to avoid the blast. Even from miles away, the crew felt the shockwave hit the aircraft. In Washington, the news reached Truman within hours. He was solemn, not triumphant. He had ended Hiroshima, but the Japanese government still refused to surrender. 3 days later, the United States launched a second mission. This time, the bomb was Fat Man, a plutonium device more complex and more powerful than the first. The initial target, Kokura, was covered by clouds and smoke. The crew diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki, another key industrial and military hub. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated in the valley that held the city. The blast was devastating. A massive column of heat and fire erupted upward, ripping through factories, military facilities, and densely packed districts. The shockwave ricocheted between the surrounding mountains, magnifying the destruction. Within moments, tens of thousands more were dead or injured. The Japanese government, panicked, stunned, divided, finally understood that the United States possessed not one bomb, but multiple weapons capable of annihilating cities at will. Messages from Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached the imperial palace. Military officials who had vowed to fight to the death now argued that the nation faced extinction. Even so, the decision was not immediate. The war cabinet remained split. Hardliners demanded one final battle. Moderates urged surrender. Only one man could break the deadlock: Emperor Hirohito. On the night of August 14th, Hirohito recorded a message, the first time the Japanese people would ever hear his voice. He told them the war must end. The alternative, he said, was the complete destruction of the Japanese nation. The next day, Japan announced its surrender. The most destructive war in human history was over. But in Washington, Truman was quiet. He refused to celebrate publicly. He refused to claim victory for himself. He knew what the bomb had done and what it meant. He understood that he had ended the war, but also opened the door to a new age, an age where humanity now possessed the power to destroy itself. He became the only world leader to ever use atomic weapons in war, and he hoped no one would ever have to again. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, celebrations erupted across the United States. Cities filled with cheering crowds. Church bells rang. Sailors danced in the streets. Families who had spent years fearing telegrams from the War Department could finally breathe again. But inside the White House, Harry Truman did not celebrate. He did not smile for the cameras. He did not give grand speeches about victory. He walked into the Oval Office alone, sat at Roosevelt's old desk, and absorbed the reality of what had happened. He had ended the war. He had saved hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of lives that would have been lost in an invasion. But he had also authorized a level of destruction never seen before in human history. Truman understood the calculation better than anyone. The war had already consumed entire nations. Civilians had been burned alive in firebombings from Tokyo to Dresden. Soldiers had died by the tens of thousands in jungles, on beaches, in frozen forests, and in the black waters of the Pacific. The atomic bomb did not begin the brutality, it ended it. Yet the moral weight of that decision never left him. In private, Truman spoke about Hiroshima and Nagasaki with a seriousness that few Americans ever heard. He refused to frame the bomb as a triumph. He saw it only as a final, terrible necessity, the way to stop a war that had spiraled far beyond anything a human being could comprehend. In the years that followed, he defended the decision with calm conviction. He argued that the United States had warned Japan through the Potsdam Declaration. He stressed that Japan's leaders had rejected that warning. He reminded critics that the alternative was Operation Downfall, an invasion forecasted to cost 1 million American lives and far more Japanese. But Truman also insisted on one more idea, something surprising for a man who had just wielded the most powerful weapon in existence. He believed the atomic bomb should never be used again. He pushed for international agreements to control nuclear weapons. He demanded oversight, cooperation, and transparency. He spoke openly about the dangers of an arms race long before the term Cold War even existed. Truman once said, "We thank God it has come to us, instead of to our enemies, and we pray that He may guide us to use it in His ways and for His purposes." But as the years passed, he understood something deeper. The bomb had changed the world forever. Even after Japan's surrender, the future felt uncertain. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence across Eastern Europe. Former allies had become emerging rivals. The atomic age had begun, and no one truly knew where it would lead. Yet Truman carried that burden quietly. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't revise history to ease his conscience. He always returned to one simple truth, a truth that defined the end of World War II and the start of the modern world. He believed he had done what was necessary to save lives. He believed he had chosen the least terrible of the terrible options. And he accepted full responsibility for it, without hesitation. When he left office in 1953, he walked out without regret. He returned to Missouri, a private citizen, the same plain-spoken man who had been thrust into the presidency with almost no warning and forced to make a decision no leader before or since has ever faced. He never apologized for using the atomic bomb, but he never glorified it either. He viewed it the way only the man who made the decision could, not as power, not as victory, but as a burden, a heavy one, carried so that the war could finally end. And that burden shaped the world we live in to this day. A world defined by the decision made in the summer of 1945, a world shaped by the moment Harry S. Truman learned about the Manhattan Project and the bold move he ultimately made.